couple things. So a couple of things. One is that it's often not a very big piece of time.
Right.
So if you listen to these stories, they're all pretty much similarly. She seemed okay, and then within a very couple, 3 months, things went desperately wrong. And that is normally the story that I get. That you don't have long period of sort of prodromal anorexia. You may have a lot of anxiety or personality features, which could turn into a lot of other things. It could be anxiety. It could be just, being a really good athlete in some area. You don't know how that's going to go. But when it starts being focused on food and weight, and in the mind of a person who's got the kind of achievement orientation that these kids have, and I always say, if you don't get straight A's, you probably don't have anorexia. That's the kids in my office. That's just, they just are high performers, and they care about that. So when they latch onto something like this, it can be very fast when they go. So yeah, if you can catch it early, and you can prevent the weight loss from starting and the behaviors that are maintaining it becoming so entrenched, then you're going to hopefully avoid hospitalization or the worst physical signs. And probably the thing that's most treacherous is if they kind of get to a somewhat low weight, but not low enough and no one does anything, and they stay at this sort of worrying low weight where no one's changing anything. Like the parents, the middle parent, Harriet, actually there's a lot of evidence she had lost a lot of weight for a while. And she kind of goes back and because not until the graduation when I saw her at a distance. And I hear that a lot from parents. I said, grandma came and she said, what's wrong with her? Because they had adjusted in their family life. They couldn't see. They couldn't see what was really happening in front of them. So if that happens, then you've let more time go by, and the behaviors and the thinking get more and more entrenched. And of course, in all of these cases, these were young adolescents, right? So they had not a long course already. So they were only 6, 7, 8 months into the illness before they were identified. That makes a huge difference in terms, just like with any illness, if you can treat it early, your chances of recovery are much greater than if it becomes a chronic condition when it advances. So there are stages, and I think a person with early anorexia, by that they can have just as severe weight loss as somebody who had anorexia for 5 years, but the difference is that person hasn't lost and turned their whole life over to anorexia for 5 years. So that's a very different kind of scenario at that later stage, which by that point we really don't have great interventions yet. I don't, because I wouldn't put up with that. So I would really, yeah, there's attempts to do that, but parents that work with us, we tell them how dangerous that is. Trying to stay right at the cusp of something dangerous, but it's close. Like, she's just staying just above. That's still going to actually make changing later harder, because the behaviors and the thinking are still really present and being sustained. And lulling oneself into thinking that that's going to be okay is something I try and help parents not to do. Actually see, no, that's not going to be it. It's going to continue and get worse. Yes? There are no, you want me to tell you the answer, and I can't, because it's your family who has to decide. Each of these parents were different, and they used different strategies. And if I told you, I tell this to parents, if I told you what to do, you would do it, and it wouldn't work. And then you'd say, you don't know what you're talking about. And I would be right, because I wouldn't, because it's going to have to be what you can do, and what your family, the resources that you bring, which is going to be unique to your family. So the solutions, you heard them, they were all different, right? The last, Jane and Bert, they divided. You know, Jane did all the cooking, and she did all the sitting, and Bert was, because he was so easily charmed by his rather wonderful daughter, did other things, supportive things. Whereas the first couple, they worked everything together. They did all of it together. So you don't always have to do the same thing as a couple or as parents. And sometimes you're a single parent, and at least you don't have to disagree with anybody. But there is, the thing that they actually all said was consistent, persistent, no backing down, no negotiating. I love the thing that Jane said about, you know, in an effort to be kind, I tried to give Sarah some choice, and in the end, that was not kind. It made it harder. She couldn't do it. It made us all get dragged in the mud even further. It seemed like a nice thing to do, and of course, she didn't mean to do anything harmful, but it ended up she had to learn from it. And by the way, they also all admitted it didn't go perfectly. I had to learn, this didn't work. I had to change. So there is not an answer like that, except to say you have to put the loopholes. Every way of getting around the illness that the child can come up with needs to be addressed. And you know, think about it as a net. Anorexia is trying to get through, and you need to make the meshing tight enough that the behaviors cannot escape. And in that sense, you're doing an inpatient unit at home. But the difference between an inpatient unit and home is a lot. Inpatient unit, you've got all these different staff, you've got people doing these meals and things. That's not the real world, and it's not generalizable. You can't take that learning from there and bring it home. If you're doing it at home, gradually doing it in that environment and in your school, that's when you master a skill. It's true for everything. And we know that doesn't work because we've tried hospitalizing kids for years at a time, restoring them completely. For the last 120 years we've tried that. It doesn't work. When they leave, they lose the weight they gain. Doesn't mean that you sometimes don't need medical hospitalization for safety, but it will not cure people. You cannot generalize from that environment. Yeah, so, you know, I mean, I've had ponies and cars, and I'll come to that, but I'll start with the rewards. Sometimes parents are affluent and have the ability to reward highly, in theory. And when they try that, the first thing they learn is they have a pony in a paddock and a car in a garage and a girl in the hospital. It's not, unless the reward is some other kind of thing. The reward that I think some kids have is when there's something else in life that still pulls them. For example, an athlete, some of the athletes want so much to be able to get back to their sport that they will actually recognize, okay, as much as this is hard, it's worth trying because I do want actually to do my sport. And that's important because that little bit pulls them forward. When I talk about how people get well from anorexia, this is how I describe it. People get well from anorexia because life is more attractive. So life pushes anorexia out. It's not because anorexia goes, because life is much more compelling than anorexia. So that's what you've got to get to. The consequences. So I think you might mean punishment. So one of the things I really like about this video is that these parents all recognized that. I think Harriet said very clearly, sometimes I would get mad. She didn't quite admit to exactly those words, but she said I couldn't sit at the table without getting where I wasn't going to be helpful anymore. And I realized that my emotional state wasn't going to be helpful. And so creating punishing consequences is usually a result of frustration and of being angry at the illness. So usually it's not the right way to go. So containment is different than punishment. When Bert had to knock down the bathroom door, I bet he wasn't happy about that. But he recognized he had to take care of his daughter. But I don't think she got punished for that. I'm sure she didn't. Yes. Part is because that's often where the thinking started, getting to get off. They might have lost a little weight because they want to be healthier or do something better. But when it starts to go off somewhere between 85 and 90%, that's where the thinking gets really more chaotic initially. So when you're going back there, it's a return. So a couple of things that I think happen. One is that parents are anxious about turning it over because, oh my God, getting hold of it was hard enough to begin with. And now you want me to let her have that back again? That's too scary. And the second is, they're so tired that they want to get rid of it too quickly. So they go, oh my gosh, thank goodness she's better enough. Go back to school, eat. And neither of those extremes really work. It's got to be really planful to manage both the anxiety of the patient and the parents to make sure that each step you take is going to be one that everyone can get behind and feel safe with. We heard all three of them talk about that. All three parents talked about transitioning to more independent eating. And they made it sound pretty easy, but it isn't always. And sometimes I've had kids certainly get very stuck there. That they are only eating because someone's making them, and that's what's made it okay. The anorexic belief is really strong, and so they say, I'm not really eating, I'm just eating because you're making me. So that's a very, it doesn't sound rational, but to an anorexic mind, we can say, I'm not really eating, you're making me eat. So I have some very compliant kids that have done that. It's very hard work to get them to test that and to keep on pressing against it, but you do have to. Because you don't want to leave them there. What people absolutely misunderstand about this approach of parents being in charge, that's not supposed to last very long. It's supposed to last 2 months, 2 to 3 months. So one thing I'm always struck by when I go other places is how much longer treatment seems to last than it does where we are. On average, our treatments last 15 sessions for 15 months. So it's not, that's average. So many are shorter and many are somewhat longer. If it's going beyond that, there's something amiss. On average, just if we look at the different groups where we've just done this, about 15 months and 15 sessions. Usually the sessions are weekly at the beginning and you titrate them down as people get mastery over things. So, and what that means is, there's some spread. Some are fine at 6 or 7 sessions and some need 25, but it's unusual at those extremes. No, there's no psychology. I've given that up. You have to disrupt and maintain behaviors. Anorexia is all about not eating and over-exercising. Once you stop those behaviors, the cognitions have no traction. So if you can disrupt those long enough in the environment in which they're manifest, not a hospital or something like that, at home, you begin to actually erode the support of those cognitions. Because once you start eating and you stop over-exercising, you just can't hold on to the thinking in quite the same way. It drags. So normally what I see is weight restoration about 4 or 5 months into treatment, and then thinking changing 4, 8, 9 months later. And that's because the thinking has to drag behind. It has to be compelling. So you have to maintain that disruption. You could think about it, and I'm cautious with this analogy, but you could think about it as someone who has to give up drinking. If they don't maintain it for a long enough period, they're liable to relapse. So you have to keep maintaining that progress over those months before the thinking and the desire will shift away. There's usually ways restored, health is restored. There may be still some thinking left, but it's not enough to pull them under in most cases. And so you'll still see improvement in cognition over another 6-12 months usually. That's what we measure that in studies, and we see that. It's a great question. I mean, I used to really want to have insight and understanding the effect, but you really think about how just irrational anorexia is. It's not something you can really argue with successfully to get someone to really understand. Listen, the thing is, this is the weirdest thing to happen to your kid. You know, you have these wonderful kids, and they're wonderful kids, usually. You know, they've been terrific. They're the kind of kids everyone thinks they want. And suddenly, they're gone way off kilter. And usually it's suddenly, 3 or 4 months, and it's left, and they have this, just blossoming time of their life. Parents are understandably confused. And, I spend a lot of time with people and I understand how they think. I have to help parents understand, okay, that's what that book's for up here. That book tries to convey to parents what the thinking of a kid with anorexia is really like. And once you kind of get into that thinking, kind of understand it, it's easier to say, okay, like this parent said, it wasn't the same kid anymore. And they had different ways of describing it. It's not just the thinking, the emotionality, the relatability, the argument. These were not kids who would throw things before and, be really kind of the idea of needing an exorcism. This was not the experience of this kid before. So there's teaching around that and truly accepting that this is not your kid anymore. She's got a disorder. She doesn't choose it. She can't control it. You need to get in there. And if you don't, it's going to be really challenging. So to understand, for her, I really liked what the first dad said. We realized that she just was too young and fragile. She couldn't really do this herself. And when you really think about it, we don't really turn most kids on themselves at 14 to solve these kinds of big problems. And there's a good reason. You met a 14-year-old boy lately? You're really not going to let him drive a car, let alone solve major problems. Yeah. It's not just the weight. The weight makes a difference, right? Because you've got physiologic health. But you remember, I like to always say, weight gain at the beginning actually, they got harder to deal with initially because they could fight you better. So when we got to be clear that weight alone did it, we would be great. So you got to get the weight and disruptive behaviors.
She went to college. She had suddenly back on her own for the first time, and she began to wobble, I think is how Jane put it. And so there was something stressful about that. And even though Sarah, you could tell she's a remarkable young woman, she wobbled anyway, and she got picked up quick enough that they could do it. But yes, you're vulnerable. Relapse from anything, whether it's depression or an anxiety disorder or many medical illnesses, is possible even after you have recovered. You can get a new episode of it. I think there are. I think there are activities and jobs and stuff that you would be pretty cautious about. When I wouldn't be happy if my daughter was anorexic and did gymnastics and then wanted to go back to gymnastics. I probably wouldn't really want to support that because I think it increases the risks too much. The same with long distance running I have with some boys that I've treated. Whereas if they did team sport, I'm much more comfortable that they're going to, or shift to a team sport. I'm going to be much more comfortable because there's a social process that protects that isolation around performance, and particularly athletic performance. So those kinds of things. There's also certain kinds of jobs, modeling, and I wouldn't really want to encourage that, where weight gets focused on so much. Team sports aren't totally protective. You can still get into mischief with them, especially if you're doing a lot of conditioning related to them.
Yeah.
So that playing the sport is okay, but if there's a huge amount of isolating conditioning, then you can still get into a risk situation. But overall, the social processes are protective. Anorexia likes to be alone. It's the Marlene Dietrich of disorders. I think that's important to say that I hope I didn't imply that family-based treatment works for everybody. Did I say that? I hope I didn't, because it doesn't. But then again, antibiotics don't work for everybody either. No treatment does. Suicide trumps anorexia. It's the only thing I can think of that does. So if she's truly suicidal, as she apparently is, you really can't keep her at home to work on these things. She has to be in a place where she's safe. That's not one of the things that we would target because it's too much. It's too big a problem. So most of the girls with anorexia do not have that problem. They might threaten it. They might actually, get pretty serious about making their parents afraid, but very few of them actually do it. Your daughter is an exception, and I'm sorry about that. I don't really have an answer to that problem. None. So sadly, if someone stays ill with anorexia for more than 3 or 4 years, their chances of recovery are not high. They can get better, they can improve different things, but if they're younger than that, you can actually maybe get them totally recovered, at least some of them. That's much harder to do. So if you look at long-term studies, this is really one of the saddest things. People have tried to find all kinds of things to be helpful. There's some different ways to think about it. First of all, maybe our interventions that we've tried just aren't the right ones. 2, maybe once you get to a certain point, it's really, really difficult to recover, just like if you have any chronic illness. And you need to think about it as managing a chronic illness then, as opposed to thinking about recovery. And there are things to help with those things. I mean, you can improve people's health so they need less medical intervention and have better physical health. You can improve their socialization. You can create opportunities and improve that. You can improve their thinking through cognitive remediation kind of activities. So there's a lot of things you can improve. But whether you can actually say that anorexia is as this out of their life is something that's much harder. I'm sorry I have to stop. I want to thank you for inviting me to be here, and I appreciate it. And I hope that the parents here, one of the things I didn't get to say is parents, one of the reasons we don't have answers is people aren't asking us, funding us to find the answers. There are nine, to answer your question, 9 randomized clinical trials of adults with 513 people total in them in 120 years of anorexia nervosa. There are 8 adolescent studies with about 700 kids in them. That's the world literature on science to tell you what to do. That's not enough. It's not enough. And so with like autism or schizophrenia, we have got to get parents out there demanding that there's funds to support research because we don't have answers. We do not have enough information to give answers. So what I tell you today is this tiny little bit of data that we put together in the last 10 years. It's terrible. As a doctor, I started off as a doctor. I ended up having to be a researcher because there were no answers. So from my perspective, if there's anything, if you can build on what they've done with autism and what they've done with schizophrenia and other disorders as parents, your voices to demand that there be more evidence created for how to be helpful is essential. Otherwise, the whole field will just continue to muddle along, trying to do the best we can. Everyone does try to do the best they can, but we need help. We actually need some science. Thank you.